Greetings. My name is Peter Krause. I'm an associate professor of political science at Boston College and a research affiliate at the MIT Security Studies program. Very excited today to present to you the 2024 US election and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, how the outcome here impacts the situation there. I first just want to thank the organizers of MENA MIT, Rich Nielsen and David Dolev, for inviting me to do this talk. As some of you may know, and I've seen some of you before, I did a long series of talks last fall and last spring for the MIT community on the situation in Gaza, on the Israeli hostages on October 7th, on US foreign policy, the history of peace processes, a wide variety of topics. So if you're interested more in kind of historical issues regarding the history of the Zionist movement, the history of the Palestinian national movement, those recordings are available via MENA MIT. So if you go on their website, I believe you can request access to and watch the videos from kind of prior, more historical discussions. Today's discussion is going to be largely present day and kind of future looking. So I'll talk briefly at the beginning about some historical stuff regarding US relations with the Israelis and Palestinians. But most of today is all about understanding how the current election that's coming up in just a couple of months will impact the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with a focus on former President Trump and Vice President Harris and what their policies would be regarding Palestinians and Israelis. To be clear, this is not a talk about endorsing any given candidate. My goal is to, using the words of the candidates in many ways, walk you through what their policy positions are, the things that they've done in the past about this issue, and hopefully help you understand and make your own decision regarding the coming election. So in terms of the overall objectives of these sessions, and again, as I'll mention, there's going to be a few more of these this fall as there was last year. I'm trying to increase knowledge and hopefully understanding and empathy. The goal here is not to generate unanimity. I don't think there is unanimity in the people watching this video, and I don't think there's going to be some at the end, and that's just fine. Reasonable, intelligent people can come to different conclusions about these issues. What I am trying to do is provide a foundation for the MIT community so you have greater knowledge and understanding. So whether you're talking to a colleague or to a friend or to someone in your family, you have a richer understanding about these issues and hopefully can engage in a more constructive fashion. And hopefully this is an alternative of sorts to kind of what I call like the junk food of social media. Now, it doesn't mean that all social media is junk. In fact, there's a lot of great stuff on social media from citizen journalists or those folks on the ground who can give you, video and imagery of the things that are happening, which I think is very important. It's just a lot of social media is also, ad hominem attacks, really short, unnuanced points, often by people who don't really understand the situation. So, this video and these presentations will hopefully help to counter or at least complement some of that. In terms of what we're going to be talking about today in the next couple of months, so today's session, which, the live session happened on September 11th. This is recorded a couple days afterwards. But as I say, we're going to talk about the 2024 US election. Then next month on October 9th, we're going to talk about how words matter, basically understanding how Palestinians and Israelis define, use, and react to what I call kind of charged or sensitive terms like terrorism, settler, intifada, peace. These are terms that you've probably heard before. Maybe you've used them before. It's very possible in your own personal conversations, you or someone else has used one of those terms, and all of a sudden the conversation comes to a screeching halt, or the emotions really ramp up, and maybe ultimately the conversation does not end in the most positive or constructive manner. So that session in many ways is to focus on language and help you to understand how, even though, yes, Palestinians and Israelis both to varying degrees use these different terms, they have different ways of defining them. They have different ways of utilizing them. And at the end of the day, you have to use words to talk, but hopefully this will help you understand how a word that's used will be received by others, and also maybe how you receive some of these words. And so ultimately, you can find ways to discuss the meaning of the terms, or maybe discuss the context sometimes without those exact words if you want to get your broader point across or focus on the context. So that will be the focus of the October talk. And then finally in November, going to focus on the struggle over normalization and the future of American, Arab, and Israeli relations in the Middle East and North Africa region. So we'll get on a little bit of that today, but basically, as you know, there was the Abraham Accords back in 2020, where you had a number of countries in the region who recognized and started to build stronger relations with Israel. Right before the October 7th attacks, there were strong negotiations between the Saudis, the Americans, and the Israelis over potential normalization. That obviously has not happened, in part because of the ongoing conflict, but we'll go more deeply into those issues and into broader kind of Arab-Israeli relations, whereas today is going to focus much more on kind of Palestinian-Israeli relations, if that makes sense, in the context of U.S. foreign policy. Okay, so final thing before we get going. I know some of you have been with me before and know my background, but for those of you who are watching this video with me or any video with me for the first time, just want to do a brief introduction of exactly who I am and where I'm coming from. So I completed my PhD here at MIT back in 2011 in the political science department. My dissertation, which became my first book, is pictured here on the left, Rebel Power: Why National Movements Compete, Fight, and Win. And that book answered two key questions. One, why do some national movements achieve states and others don't? And two, why do national movements vary sometimes in their use of violence or nonviolence to try to achieve statehood? And as you can probably see from the cover where I have these different, raised fists here, we have one of the cases is the Palestinian national movement. Another of the key cases is the Zionist movement. So I spent a number of years living in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ramallah, Amman, surrounding countries in the region, interviewing Israelis and Palestinians who have been involved in these national movements, pushing for statehood, pushing for the state of Israel to be established in 1948, pushing for a state of Palestine to be established, and also trying to understand why at various points did their political parties or armed groups ultimately turn to violence or turn to nonviolence for trying to achieve statehood. So that was my dissertation at MIT in my first book. And again, a lot of the field research I've done living in the region, interacting with and learning from Palestinians and Israelis comes from that research, which I've continued as a professor at Boston College. I've also co-edited a book that deals with field research and how you actually go about doing ethical and effective field research and interviews, especially amidst conflict. And so that's pictured there. I've taught classes on the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian relations and conflict for over a decade now, both at Boston College, where I'm an associate professor, and at MIT during the IAP period over the January term. Over the summers, I actually work with a few Israeli-Palestinian person-to-person peace-building organizations that are pictured here. So one is called Our Generation Speaks, that deals with 20 to 30-year-old entrepreneurs who come to Brandeis for a summer and then are pitching to win, significant seed money for their startups. But simultaneously, I'm the academic director who helps to teach them about the other's historical narrative and history and lead facilitated discussions on very challenging issues that we see all around us today. I've done something similar in more recent years with MEET, which is Middle East Entrepreneurs of Tomorrow, that actually is affiliated with and was founded by MIT graduates. So slightly younger, those individuals who join MEET are high school students, but then I've worked with those kind of more in the alumni portion of it. So again, folks in their 20s, and again, leading academic and facilitated discussions on stuff that we see all around us, right? The conflict surrounding Gaza today, stuff historically with 1948. So again, we don't dodge the elephants in the room. We talk directly about them, not with the idea that everyone's going to perfectly agree at the end, but that we'll have a better understanding of each other's history and perspective, hopefully humanize the other, and ultimately we hope that these are some of the future leaders for Palestine and for Israel going forward, having a better understanding of the other society of which they need to live alongside one way or another. I've been involved in some Track 2 negotiations, if you don't know what those are. That's basically negotiations that involve non-government officials. So I'm not in government. I've never been in government, but Track 2 often involves maybe former government officials or former military, or oftentimes business people or academics. So I've been part of the American delegation for a couple of different Track 2 negotiations, negotiating with Israelis and Palestinians regarding the conflict. And then I've done a series of talks, probably in the dozens, if not over 100, probably over 100, over the past decade or so for MIT Israel, Israel Lab, through the business school, MIT Arab World. There's briefly an MIT Palestine organization from the business school, which I did talks for, and now MENA MIT. So, if there's something related to Middle East politics and Israeli-Palestinian relations at MIT, I've probably engaged with them, and I'm happy to do so. More broadly, in terms of why I do this work, and I get this question anytime I'm over in the region and Israelis or Palestinians look at me and they say, who is this guy? Why does he want to study our, complex and challenging history? And there's a lot of reasons. It's not just kind of an academic's interest. I don't have personal or family ties to the region in the sense that I'm not Jewish or Muslim or Palestinian or Arab or Israeli, but I do have a lot of personal ties now, in part because I've spent so many years living and working in the region. So I have a number of Palestinian and Israeli friends and colleagues about whom I care deeply. There are, students and fellows in these programs I work with that are from Gaza, that are from Israel, that are from the West Bank. And so it's very, very challenging, as you can imagine, as it is for many of you, to watch the things that have been going on, particularly the past year, though honestly, for the entire time I've worked on this region, there have been heartbreaking things that have been happening. And so that's a lot of my motivation, is that I'm an American and I'm a proud American, even though I have a lot of critiques of our country's policy in the region. But I will simply say that I believe that U.S. has a huge role to play in Middle East politics, and particularly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so I became a teacher, first a high school teacher for 2 years, and now a college professor, because I believe, perhaps naively, but I think probably correctly, that the best policy comes from having a lot of knowledge about the situation. And I think, unfortunately, many Americans are not too knowledgeable about the Middle East or about Israeli-Palestinian relations. And so I wanted to improve, of course, my own knowledge, but also try to spread that through teaching my students. I do a lot of talks in community groups and business organizations and religious organizations, just trying to improve understanding of the people and the situation that the U.S. is involved in one way or another, and hope that in some ways that leads to peace and stability and dignity for the people of the region, particularly Palestinians and Israelis. So that's why I do this work. That's why I got involved. And, having this talk beyond the initial one beyond September 11th also has some resonance for me, because I was already a double history poli-sci major focused on the Middle East my senior year of college. But, when that attack happened, it just further resonated for me. Yes, this is a region that the United States is going to be involved in for a long time, that most Americans don't have a lot of understanding of. And so it just even further motivated me to do what I wanted to do, which is become a teacher starting the very next year. So in any case, that's who I am. If you have further questions, I can attend the future sessions live. So this session obviously being recorded, I'm just going to go through and do the talk. But for each of these sessions that I mentioned before, we do it live. And so I intersperse questions throughout. So if you have further questions about me or about the stuff I'm interested in, or of course the content, please attend. I'd love to have you. All right, so one of the first things to think about when I did this talk was it was the night after the first debate, perhaps the last debate as well, between Trump and Harris. That was purposely done. So hopefully a number, if not most of you, have watched the debate at this point. If not, I commend it to you. I think it was a very interesting debate, even though it's always a lot of shorter answers and a lot crammed into one, especially since it seems like this might have been the only debate. But later on in the talk, I'm going to go through word by word everything Trump and everything Harris said regarding the Israeli-Palestinian issue, because it sheds some light for sure on the various candidates' policies. So keep that in the background as we dive into some of the history and then present day stuff. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? First, as I say, I'm just going to do a little brief background on U.S. support for Israelis and Palestinians historically. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about grand strategy, which is kind of a much broader vision for how the U.S. should kind of cause security for itself. What should its foreign policy kind of vision be for the broader region as well as the world? Because that in many ways informs, U.S. individual policies regarding Israelis, regarding Palestinians, regarding Iran, regarding Saudi. Then thirdly, we will turn to international relations of the region. So not just U.S. policy, but also more broadly relations between different countries in the Middle East and the impact that that has. Then we'll turn to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, talking about plans for resolution. So again, for each of these, I'm going to talk about where Trump and Harris fall. Like, what is Trump's potential grand strategy? What is Harris's potential grand strategy? So we'll talk as well about how does Harris potentially want to try to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? How does Trump potentially want to resolve the conflict? So we'll talk about their plans, or at least proposed plans. Fifth, we'll dive a little more deeply into specific aspects of those plans. So though some of you may know, there's certain final status issues, which are the most important, but also maybe the thorniest issues for this situation. So the borders potentially between Israel and a potential state of Palestine, or if there's going to be a state of Palestine, we'll talk about that. Jerusalem, what happens to this holy place that both communities and both national movements claim as their capital? How do you deal with Israeli settlements? How do you deal with Palestinian refugees? Like, these are all issues that have to be hashed out. So I'll talk about what the candidates have said or implied about how they would handle each of those issues as president. Sixthly, we'll talk about the October 7th attacks, the humanitarian crisis and Israeli invasion of Gaza, and the broader Israel-Hamas war, and what each candidate has said about that. And then finally, we'll focus a little more particularly on the debate from a few days ago, the statements the candidates have made, and then a little bit about what they've said about campus protests and things in the United States on this issue going forward. My key takeaway, so bluff is bottom line up front, which is something that a lot of policy folks and sometimes academics say as well, because I don't want you to wait to the end in terms of the overall take, though honestly, there's a lot of detail here. But in general, It's true, as some people say, that Trump and Harris have more similarities on this issue than they do on other hot button issues. So whether it's immigration or abortion or January 6th, I think Trump and Harris have significant difference on their policies on those three issues. On Israelis and Palestinians, there are key differences, which we'll talk about, but they're kind of closer on the spectrum than they certainly are on some of those other issues. At the same time, if you ever hear someone say, "Oh, there's no difference between Trump and Harris. There's no be any change regardless of who's in power." I strongly disagree with that statement. I think there are significant differences on a number of issues, and I'll walk you through those throughout this talk. So away we go. Let's start just a little bit before Trump and Harris, looking at historically how the United States has supported both Israelis and Palestinians. So first, on the Israeli side, the U.S. was actually the first country to recognize Israel in 1948 when Ben Gurion declared independence. President Truman, jumped right in and had the U.S. recognize the Israelis, even though actually he faced pushback on doing that from his State Department and some of his advisors. He nonetheless did so. It's correct that the U.S. has long been an ally and a supporter of Israel, although you don't want to read history backwards and say, oh, right from when Truman recognized Israel, the U.S. was providing the Israelis with lots of money, lots of weapons, lots of diplomatic support. That's in fact not true. It really takes until the late 60s and really the early 70s before the U.S. starts to give significant military and economic funding to the Israelis. In that earlier period, in the mid 40s and early 50s and late 50s, they're actually buying a lot. The Israelis are buying a lot of their weapons from Europe, from the French, from the Czechs, from a number of different places. And the Americans are certainly not enemies of the Israelis, but they go against Israel on a number of issues. In the 56 war, they stand down and push back against the Israelis, as well as the British and the French for their attack and invasion against Egypt. Israel builds its nuclear program basically entirely in secret from the Americans, and the Americans are not happy when they learn about it. So just because the U.S. has been a very strong ally to the Israelis for a number of decades now, you should not think that that's always been the case. It's always been a positive relationship, but not always the same as it is today. That being said, since especially the 1973 war, Israel has been generally the largest recipient of U.S. foreign military aid. It represents about 15% of Israel's defense budget, which is a significant chunk. The U.S. also sells Israel, as part of that aid, some very high-level weaponry that significantly helps the IDF and its general security and defense, as well as its ongoing conflicts. There's significant trade between Israel and the U.S. to the tune of about $50 billion a year. And diplomatically, as you may know, at the United Nations, there have been a number of attempts to criticize or sanction Israel regarding a variety of things, from different conflicts to settlements to other issues. And the U.S. has been a pretty reliable ally to Israel in the sense that it vetoes the vast majority of those resolutions at the Security Council. So there have been a couple examples where the U.S. has abstained, but generally the U.S. has vetoed those resolutions targeting Israel. And in terms of U.S. support for Israel, the U.S. not only has, depending on how you count it, the first or second largest Jewish population in the world after Israel, but in fact, the majority of Zionists, those who support not just Israel, but the idea of kind of a Jewish state of Israel in the U.S., are not Jewish. A lot of them are Christian or evangelical Christian who are, strong supporters of the state. So it's one of the reasons that the Americans, along with Israeli democracy, and along with the Cold War, in which Israel was an ally vis-a-vis kind of the Soviet bloc of Iraq and Syria and some other states, the U.S. has long been a pretty strong supporter of the Israelis, and certainly is the most important supporter and ally of the Israelis today. Now, on the Palestinian side, it's correct to say, as you can see in the chart in the bottom left, that the U.S. has often been the biggest economic donor to the Palestinians. But the amount of money is significantly different than the support for the Israelis. So if you look on the previous chart, we're talking in the billions, and U.S. Congress and President Biden just signed on to over $14 billion more to be given to the Israelis. Whereas if we're looking at the Palestinians and U.S. aid to the Palestinians, this is in the hundreds of millions. So even in the biggest year, which looks like 2009, close to $1 billion, that's still, less than 1/10 than what Congress just passed for the Israelis, this past year. So in a broader sense, the amount of aid given to the Palestinians is much less. At the same time, the U.S. does recognize the PLO as the representative of the Palestinians going back to Oslo, and the Palestinian Authority as the kind of Palestinian government or governments in waiting in the West Bank and Gaza, though they're not really functioning in Gaza and haven't been for a while. Previous presidents have gone back and forth on this a bit. Obama's first call was to Mahmoud Abbas, trying to, help the Palestinians and also help the Israelis in a broader sense, trying to push for this two-state solution that he and other presidents had believed in. There've been a back and forth on funding for the Palestinian refugees, which we'll talk about, that Trump pulled and then Biden reinstated. Palestinians get a significant amount of support from some Americans on kind of social justice or human rights grounds. So you do have, even though it's a smaller percentage, you do have a significant mass of support who identify themselves as pro-Palestinian in a variety of ways in the United States. And from the Palestinians' perspective, most of them would look and say the U.S. is not an honest broker. Certainly, the U.S. has been involved in negotiations with Palestinians and Israelis, but there are very, very few, if any, Palestinians who see the United States as kind of neutral in this conflict or in this struggle. That being said, whether from the negotiations that I've been part of or colleagues and folks that I work with on the Palestinian side, most of them will say the U.S. is absolutely not neutral. They're much more, in favor of the Israelis and have supported the Israelis. But most will still say the United States is kind of indispensable because it is the only country that has any leverage or ability to push Israel towards a deal or on any of its policies. So even though the Palestinians don't think, and I think they're probably correct, that the United States is not right in the middle historically, the U.S. is still probably an indispensable actor in some aspects of this conflict and potentially resolving it. Okay, let's talk about U.S. grand strategy. So in a broad sense, what is grand strategy? It's the idea that any state is trying to, first and foremost, kind of cause security and potentially prosperity for itself. And so grand strategy is this fancy term of how do you do that? How do you take all the tools at your disposal, your military, your State Department, your diplomatic corps, your Secretary of the Treasury, your economics and business, your soft power with public diplomacy, like how do you take all of those things and come up with some general cohesive vision and strategy for how you're going to make your country as safe and prosperous as possible? That's the idea of grand strategy. And many people would argue it's an important thing because the government is not some nimble institution that can just turn on a dime. Instead, it's like a big aircraft carrier that takes a long time to kind of make adjustments. And so if you're investing in weapons platforms, or you're trying to build allies, or you're trying to, build up investment in domestic businesses or foreign investment, like those things take years or sometimes even generations to build. And so if you don't have some cohesive longer term strategy for what you're doing, you might have the worst of both worlds where you're jumping around on your policy, there's no cohesive vision, and so ultimately your country's not as safe and prosperous as it could be. Now, in terms of what are these different grand strategy choices, at one end of the spectrum is actually a grand strategy that many of my mentors at MIT were strong supporters of, which is this idea of restraint. And if you want to read the book on this, probably the top book on it was written by one of my graduate advisors and professors here at MIT, Barry Posen. It's called Restraint. And restraint in a broad sense is the idea that the United States is a pretty secure nation. It's got the two greatest moats in world history, the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to either side, relatively favorable and non-threatening countries to the north and south, Canada and Mexico. And so the U.S. is going to be pretty safe, especially when you add in it has the strongest military and nuclear arsenal in the world. And so it's not that the U.S. should not be involved anywhere in the world. It's just that getting involved militarily in most conflicts is probably not in the U.S. interest. It costs money, it costs lives, both American and foreign lives, and ultimately the benefits often are not outweighed by the costs. And so there are certain conflicts that restrainers would be in favor of, preventing the rise of a regional hegemon, or if a terrorist organization was about to get nuclear weapons or things like that. But many of the conflicts, including many of the ones pictured here in this kind of slightly cheeky diagram, restrainers would have said, don't get involved in that. In fact, they did say don't get involved in Iraq, don't get involved in Libya. And so they would look at a chart like this and say, yes, this is one of the takeaways, whether it was the Bush administration, George W. Bush, or the Obama administration, or the Trump administration, or the Biden administration. This is not a partisan thing. It's like all of these interventions the U.S. has had in the Middle East, whether there's been regime change or not, or American boots on the ground or not, or airstrikes, the outcome to varying degrees has been disastrous, whether in Iraq or in Libya or in Syria or in Afghanistan. Like none of these have gone really the way the Americans wanted, right? The Taliban's back in power in Afghanistan. Iraq did not become the democracy that America wanted or the pro-American state that it wanted. It's been more tied to Iran for a variety of reasons. Libya's had a variety of warring governments and a lack of stability. The Assad regime is still in power in Syria, and that country's in ruins. So it doesn't mean that the Americans are fully responsible for all of these outcomes. They're not, but they also bear some responsibility and more than others in some of these conflicts. And so restrainers would argue, hey, This shows that even though America is the most powerful country in the world, maybe in world history, its ability to impact policies and political outcomes in the Middle East is less than you might think. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you have this idea of deep engagement, which, to be clear, is historically the most common grand strategy for the United States, especially in the past, couple of generations. So deep engagement is in many ways the opposite of restraint. It believes in a forward deployment of US diplomatic and military and economic forces around the world. The idea being that whether in the Middle East or in East Asia or in Europe right now around Ukraine, the US is a very strong country. It should be able to reassure its allies, deter its enemies, and ultimately its presence can be a presence that promotes peace and stability. So deep engagers would say, well, if the US pulled out of East Asia, it's going to make it much more likely that China will try to, take over Taiwan, perhaps threaten, US allies like Japan. Those countries might decide to go nuclear. And even if you feel like once that's settled, it could be a more stable place, that transition could be quite unstable and lead to some massive, massive conflicts. So deep engagers will often argue that the US is a balancing or stabilizing presence in many of these regions. And in the Middle East in particular, there's a couple other things that are argued. One is that if the US is not there, there isn't necessarily clear guaranteed access to the very important oil and natural gas shipments that come out of the region, because either Iran or perhaps even a non-state or terrorist organization could try to stop shipping in choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. If you're interested in that issue, another great MIT professor who just became part of the faculty after getting her PhD previously, Caitlin Talmadge, wrote a great article about that. And then counterterrorism, right? So especially in the aftermath of 9/11, the US has been deployed to places like Afghanistan, Iraq, involved in Yemen, Syria, not just because they've been trying to topple governments, but because the US has been trying to target with drone strikes or special forces and others, some of these organizations, so they're weaker and they have less capability to strike the American homeland or American interests. So this is kind of the idea of deep engagement, and President Biden and Vice President Harris generally fall kind of into this camp. If we think about other candidates, and again, this is not a perfect scientific spectrum here, this is just my kind of placement on this. It's not necessarily a partisan thing, particularly in the Republican Party, you can see a wide array of positions. So someone like the former senator and presidential candidate John McCain, I think would be called a deep engager in the sense that he also promoted a robust American presence abroad. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, you have Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, who's been one of the most vocal supporters of restraint. And I think former President Trump is somewhere in the middle, probably leaning more towards the restraint side, but kind of a mixed bag because he simultaneously has wanted, and again, he's actually the one who signed the deal to get the US out of Afghanistan, wanted to pull US troops out of Syria and Iraq and elsewhere in the region. But he also talks about the US is going to be the strongest military in the world. We don't want to be weak like he implies that they were and we were under previous American presidents. And he says that, no one would have done what they would have done, whether it's October 7th or other things, if I had been in office, kind of saying he has very strong deterrence and red lines, but then also implying that if someone did do those things, that the US would get quite involved or at least have strong military responses. So I don't think he's a, true blue restrainer, but I think he has inklings that go in that direction, which fit with kind of in his broader America First policy. And if we look historically at something that was called, isolationism, which some restrainers are, don't really like that term, but there are some connections historically to, the policy of isolationism, of pulling in and pulling back a bit from the world because of the focus on domestic issues or otherwise that I think Trump fits within. Again, going back to Harris, we have a little less of her record because she's vice president. Vice president doesn't set foreign policy, but she has been a candidate a few times now and has talked about some of this stuff. And I think her statements, especially on Israel-Palestine, but in broader things as well, put her within kind of the deep engagement camp, if that makes sense. In terms of things that have been said, so let's actually go to the words of the candidates. So we'll go back and forth of who we're starting with. This time we'll start with Trump. At his last inauguration in 2017, he said, quote, "The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. From this moment on, it's going to be America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families." So again, fitting this in that broader context. Now, one of his former national security advisors, who, to be clear, has become quite a Trump critic, but served with Trump in 2018, 2019, John Bolton, pictured here holding his glasses, said that Trump has no coherent foreign policy views and that his decisions are, quote, ad hoc, anecdotal, and transactional. Now, to be clear, that's not necessarily fully different than some other presidents in the sense that as much as political scientists like to talk about grand strategy and maybe imply or even explicitly say that presidents should have one, many presidents have done policies that when you add them all up, it doesn't look like this clear, the Monroe Doctrine or the Eisenhower Doctrine or whatever. It's kind of like responding to events on the ground. In fact, for the Middle East, George W. Bush came to office saying, we're not going to nation build, particularly in the Middle East. And then what does the U.S. get involved in? Multiple nation building efforts in the Middle East because of 9/11. You have other presidents come in saying, oh, we're going to pivot to Asia, right? Biden said that to some extent. Trump said that to some extent. And then the United States cannot seem to pivot out of the Middle East for a variety of reasons. And so, again, there isn't always this vision, but, Bolton's arguing, and I think there's some evidence for this as well, that, a lot of Trump's policy, at least during his prior administration, was not part of this kind of single vision. A lot of it was maybe, based on what does the U.S. get out of this, or kind of more ad hoc stuff, which again, you could support or not, but just an interesting perspective there. So let's go to Harris. One of the most interesting takeaways from Harris on grand strategy came from when she was, still vice president and not a presidential candidate. So it seemed like, Biden was still running at this point, back at a Munich security conference earlier this year in Germany. And she said the following, quote, as President Biden and I have made clear over the past 3 years, we are committed to pursue global engagement, to uphold international rules and norms, to defend democratic values at home and abroad, and to work with our allies and partners in pursuit of shared goals. However, and this is where she kind of needles the restrainers and Trump to some extent, there are some in the United States who disagree. They suggest it is in our best interest of the American people to isolate ourselves from the world, to flout common understandings among nations, to embrace dictators and adopt their repressive tactics, and abandon commitments to our allies in favor of unilateral action. Let me be clear, that worldview is dangerous, destabilizing, and indeed short-sighted. That view would weaken America and would undermine global stability and undermine global prosperity. So to me, that's a pretty clear statement of saying, I generally reject restraint. I embrace much more global and deep engagement. Again, the way that she's criticizing restrainers, restrainers and Trump would probably push back on a bit and say, we're not talking about full isolation. And they would say, actually, America gets more prosperity by not spending money in kind of these foreign wars that don't work out. But from Harris's perspective, she would push back with stuff we'll talk about later regarding stuff like NATO, where it's saying, hey, this is the most successful military alliance in modern history. The U.S. should be strongly backing our NATO allies. It should be strongly backing, Ukraine, which is not in NATO, but nonetheless is, in Europe and on the doorstep of NATO allies. Whereas Trump would probably say, no, we need to resolve that conflict as soon as possible, even if it's not to the benefit of Ukraine. We should potentially pull out of NATO or at least make them pay more. So again, this is the back and forth between the two candidates here. Okay, what about international relations in the Middle East? Let's talk about a few angles here. So starting with stuff that's been done before, as I mentioned, in 2020, in the final year of office for Trump, he kind of put forward and got the signatures for something called the Abraham Accords, which is basically 4 new Arab states recognizing Israel, or at least making the intention to recognize Israel, have peace with Israel going forward. So if we look on a map, the countries that signed the Abraham Accords were Bahrain, this small little island nation here, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, although Sudan has kind of gone back and forth on this because of some domestic unrest and other issues, and then Morocco. So more strongly, it's kind of been these 3 countries, Morocco, the UAE, and Bahrain, who have kind of moved forward with the agreements they signed in 2020, which added to the list of Egypt and Jordan that had signed normalization agreements with Israel in prior decades. So this for Trump was maybe the crown jewel from many people's perspective of his foreign policy, certainly for pro-Israeli supporters and a number of other Americans. This was, seen as a big positive because it was changing the kind of paradigm of, the whole broader region minus a couple bordering countries were, at war with the Israelis or not recognizing Israel. So this started to recognize some of that changed reality, particularly with some of these Gulf countries. At the same time, October 7th and then Israel's invasion of Gaza, which has led to, significant loss of Palestinian life, has led to a lot of tension in these relationships. None of these countries have broken their ties with the Israelis, but they've become significantly strained. So, in Morocco, there's been protests of Moroccans pushing the king to pull back from normalization with the Israelis. In Bahrain, they've recalled their ambassador about, the escalation that's happened in Gaza. Jordan, that's had normalization with the Israelis since the mid-90s, has not just recalled their ambassador, they've pulled back from joint energy and environmental deals with Israel and the UAE. They've been very, very aggressive in terms of their rhetoric regarding Israeli conduct in Gaza and elsewhere. So, these relationships are still there, but they're in a much, much worse shape than they've been for quite a while because of the situation in Gaza. Now, the thing that was talked about before October 7th and seemed to be getting pretty close was the idea of a treaty between the Israelis and the Saudis, with the Americans, very, very strongly involved. In fact, in many ways, the Americans under Biden were leading the way here. It's interesting to think about why this is. You can read Greg Gause and other great scholars of Saudi policy on this stuff, but it seemed like for a while, Biden administration was holding the Saudis kind of at arm's length, both because I think they saw the Saudi leadership and Mohammed bin Salman as more kind of in Trump's orbit or favorable to the Republican leadership. There was obviously a lot of criticism over the Saudis' killing of Khashoggi, and so, human rights issues there. But in part because of energy price spiking, in part because of China maybe becoming a bigger player in the region, they kind of, in some ways were seen as shepherding, at least in the public version of it, the détente between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Biden administration actually started to put a great deal of political capital into getting a new treaty between the Saudis and the Israelis, with the U.S. honestly paying a lot of the costs of doing that. So in terms of what this was going to look like, some people related it to the idea of NATO, but like a Middle East NATO. So to understand NATO, again, there's many, many layers to it. But in terms of some of the basics, there's sometimes this phrase about NATO. And again, NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So keep the US in, the Soviets out, and the Germans down. So what this basically means is NATO was formed after World War I. There was a lot of worry among Europeans that the United States was going to leave Europe just as it left after World War I. Sorry, that's it was NATO was formed after World War II. So just as the Americans left the region after World War I, Europeans were worried that would happen again. And in this case, you have the Soviets, right there with the strongest kind of land army in Europe. And if the Americans move out, the Soviets may have kept rolling west. And so European countries wanted to keep the Americans in and on the European continent to deter the Soviets. So that was part of NATO. Secondly, obviously, as I mentioned, the Western European nations wanted the Soviets to remain out of their countries and out of the region. And then finally, the Germans, who had, to varying degrees started two world wars at that point, World War I and World War II, there was a feeling that, Germany can't really be, deterred or restrained if it's at its full strength. So we kind of need to keep Germany divided and weak to ensure the security of the French, the British, the Spanish, the Dutch, all of these other countries. So that was the idea of NATO, have this long-term military alliance, which is also a defensive alliance between the US and these largely European countries. So this alliance with the Saudis and the Israelis would do something similar. It would keep the US in the region because there's increasing concern among many Middle Eastern leaders that because of restraint and its rising relevance for some Americans and war weariness with Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan, that the US is also going to pivot out of the Middle East. And again, some American leaders have said this. There's a feeling on the American side that they'd like to keep China and maybe Russia out of the Middle East, or at least not have them be as influential. And then there's a collective goal between the Israelis, the Saudis, the Americans to keep Iran down and weak and prevent it from becoming a regional hegemon, or at least a stronger country in the region. So that would be the basics of it. Now, it didn't happen in part because of October 7th, even though I don't think that was the major motivation for October 7th. One of the results is that the Saudis, just like the Jordanians, the Moroccans, and others, their people are strongly, in general, in solidarity with the Palestinians and have been very critical of Israeli conduct in Gaza. And so there's no way the Saudis will sign a deal right now amidst everything that's going on. If and when there's a ceasefire and things calm down, I think it's possible. But for now, I don't think so. So the U.S. has actually continued under the Biden administration to try to make a deal, but to do it in phases. So they continue to negotiate with the Saudis about the idea that, okay, maybe step one can be a new treaty between the U.S. and the Saudis. And to be clear, the U.S. would be giving up a lot under this. So some of the things would be access to more advanced U.S. weaponry. A civilian Saudi nuclear program would be approved and supported by the U.S., and potentially also giving security guarantees, which again is kind of the basis of NATO, the idea that if the Saudis were attacked by anyone, the U.S. would be required to come to their aid. So these are big concessions that the United States would give. I'm not going to lie, I was a little surprised at the extent to which the U.S. would be offering all of these goodies, especially because one of the keys of this supposedly is, Israeli-Saudi relations. So it's interesting that the U.S. is kind of giving the most concessions here, but the U.S. also also have some interest in keeping the Chinese out, et cetera. But, it seems like a lot of concessions to me. But in any case, the idea would be you would have that agreement with the Saudis. In exchange, the Saudis would agree to generally like halt or at least significantly reduce any type of investment from China and certainly arms purchases. And then the second stage, maybe after the ceasefire in Gaza comes about, is when you would have Israeli-Saudi normalization and then eventually move towards resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is something the Saudis have at least publicly said they require. They've said that now they're not going to normalize with the Israelis unless there's a two-state solution or at least steps towards a two-state solution, which at least at the moment the Israeli leadership is saying they're not going to do, but we'll see. Now, what have the candidates said about this stuff? So for Trump, I think that he would like to have Saudi normalization with the Israelis, as much as Bahrain, the UAE, Morocco, to some extent Sudan, were significant. Those are still small potatoes compared to a country like Saudi Arabia, which is arguably, the leader of the Muslim world, certainly the strongest country on the Arabian Peninsula and, a major power diplomatically, economically in the region. So he would certainly like that. And he says, not incorrectly, that he's gotten along, more with Mohammed bin Salman than maybe some of the Democratic leadership has, in part because he's less critical of Saudi human rights abuses and, seems to, be okay with autocratic leadership of other countries and even admire some of the approaches or the lack of restraint that they have on their policies. Whether Trump would want kind of Middle East, North Africa, NATO, I think he'd want the normalization. I think he'd be willing to do greater arms sales and things like that, especially if it's targeting Iran. I'm not sure if he would agree to security guarantees, in part because, he talks about wanting to get out of those with Europe, with the real NATO. So I'm not sure if he would want to tie the U.S. into guaranteeing the security of the Saudis, but I don't know if that would be necessary depending on the situation to make the deal. So I think he'd be favorably inclined to it, but I don't know if he would offer everything that the Biden administration has. In terms of what Harris would do on this, I think that she would care about it. I think she hasn't said too much, but she's generally been supportive of the Biden-Harris administration's efforts on it. So I wouldn't be surprised if she continued to pursue it. But she hasn't kind of laid out a particular plan on that issue to the same way that she has on some of this other stuff. Now, what we do know a little bit more about is Iran. So on Iran, which has been fighting both directly and indirectly, wars with Israel and their allies for quite a while now, it's a big issue because going back, a few years, you had the Iran nuclear deal, which was signed under the Obama administration, under which Iran agreed to limit its nuclear enrichment, to have extensive monitoring of its nuclear program. In exchange, the U.S. pulled back on some of the sanctions on Iran, not all of them, but some of them. And so the Obama administration did that. Biden and Harris have generally been supportive of that deal, although they haven't been able to reinstate any form of it, whereas Trump pulled the U.S. out of that deal, saying it was a terrible deal. So some of the distinction between the candidates is on how you would deal with Iran. Now, I don't think either candidate is favorable to Iran. I think Harris sees Iran as an enemy and a rival. Trump sees Iran as an enemy and a rival. They would continue to combat Iran, both candidates, in terms of its actions with Hezbollah, in terms of its actions with the Houthis and going after shipping in the Red Sea, in terms of Iran's attempts to spread its influence in Iraq and elsewhere, in terms of seeing the supreme leader in the Iranian regime as an enemy. Like, I think the candidates are very similar on that issue. What's different is just whether you feel like you can kind of do any business with Iran, or if doing a nuclear deal like that is a way to actually inhibit them building nuclear weapons, which is more kind of the Harris camp, or if you believe, like Trump, talks about, hey, you just need to push for regime change and just keep tightening the screws on them, and that's how you're going to get them to back down. And again, to be honest, there hasn't been good evidence that either of those have fully worked. Trump kind of followed the hardline policy during his administration, and Iran, kept enriching uranium and kept doing a lot of the things in the Middle East. They weren't really deterred. But in a broad sense, the Iran nuclear deal, in the aftermath of that, didn't, might have slowed things down for a little while, but Iran is, still building, still enriching uranium. And if you had the plan, you could say, oh, maybe they're not, but that plan had a limit to it in terms of how long it was going to last. So long and short, Iran is a difficult issue and the candidates have differences on it, but you shouldn't believe that either candidate has the perfect solution that's going to definitely work, because Iran is a powerful country with a lot of levers to pull. And certainly the US can do a number of things to thwart it or to weaken it. But it's not going to be an issue that's easily solved by either candidate. And again, this is a little bit about on the nuclear deal, if that makes sense. And you can see in terms of what Harris said, she called Trump's pullout from the nuclear deal reckless and saying it jeopardized national security. So there are some differences here in terms of to what extent Iran should just be attacked, just push for regime change, just do hard line versus the Harris approach, which is be pretty hard line on a lot of things Iran does and certainly not be a friend to Iran, but also try to limit their nuclear program and otherwise with allies through things like monitoring and those types of deals. Okay, solutions for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So just as a background to understand, a variety of things that you hear, right? You hear two-state solution, one-state solution. In a broad sense, a two-state solution is roughly Israel in the area you see here in white, roughly the state of Israel today, plus little bits of territory potentially in the West Bank, and then a state of Palestine in Gaza in most, if not all of the West Bank. So that would be the basis in terms of what a two-state solution would look like, these two states kind of living side by side. That was what was negotiated over in varying forms for about 3 decades from the Oslo Accords onwards, but it hasn't been successful. We haven't achieved a two-state solution or resolution to the conflict. So you have more and more Israelis who are disillusioned with that. And so you have some Israelis, particularly on the right, who push for a one-state solution where they basically say, okay, we should just annex some or all of the West Bank, make it a larger Israel, and then that's it. There's one state, it's Israel, it controls most of the territory. The rest of the area can be semi-autonomous Palestinian enclaves, or maybe they can join confederations with Jordan or Egypt or something, but that's kind of the Israeli, right-wing or national religious position. On the Palestinian side, you also have more people who support one-state visions, although, again, slightly different ones. The Hamas vision would be, there's conquest and you have the entire area, West Bank, Gaza, and present-day Israel becomes Palestine. The Israeli Jewish population either gets expelled or largely flees. So that's kind of the maximalist, Palestinian position under Hamas. You also have Palestinians who support what we call a binational democratic solution, which is get rid of all the borders between West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. You have about 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Israeli Jews living in that area. Everybody votes. And under the Palestinian version of this, you would also allow the refugees to come back, which is millions of Palestinian refugees. So you now have democratic elections in this single state. You can call it Israel, Palestine, Israelstein, etc. But one of the reasons I put this under a Palestinian version is because this has a lot more support among Palestinians than Israelis, because it's not lost on either side that in that version, especially with the refugees coming back, it would be majority Palestinian. And so they would be electing generally Palestinian leadership. And for Israelis, this would be the end of kind of the Zionist dream of a Jewish majority state. So for that reason, it mostly has pro-Palestinian supporters who support that vision. Where did Trump and Harris kind of fall on the spectrum? They both have said, and with Trump's plan, he fits himself in this at least a little bit, that they're two-state solution folks, which, to be clear, fits within U.S. policy for decades. I mean, whether it was George W. Bush or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, all of these presidents to varying degrees have supported the idea of a two-state solution and tried to push diplomacy towards it. But Trump, in some of his recent comments that we're going to look at in just a moment, has implied that he's not sure if a two-state solution is going to work anymore, whereas Harris has still strongly and consistently said two-state solution. So let's look at a little bit about what they've done before and how we can talk about it. So first, if you're interested, these are 2 articles that I wrote a few years back when Trump was in office and when Biden came into office about their differing approaches to the issue. The Biden administration has followed a similar approach to the past few decades, which is the ultimate goal is a two-state solution. The way we're going to get there is having negotiations with the parties, and then we're going to negotiate over borders in Jerusalem, and that's how it's going to go. Now, Biden's difference is he came to office and basically was like, I saw when I was in the Obama administration how much diplomatic capital Obama put into this. It didn't work out, so I'm not going to do the same thing. So Biden still, I think, shared the policies of Obama, but he didn't share how he was going to carry that out. So he actually did not have a very vigorous or involved peace process, feeling probably correctly that the Israeli and Palestinian leadership either didn't want a peace right now or they weren't willing or able to deliver it. On the Trump side, he did actually do more kind of diplomacy on some of this stuff, even though the Palestinians generally wouldn't talk to him. But his approach was more in line with kind of Netanyahu and more right-wing Israelis in the sense that They believe that the reason that there's not peace is because Palestinians haven't recognized that they've lost the conflict, and they have to kind of accept, a loser's outcome in terms of how much land, whether they get a state or not, or otherwise. So, that's in many ways what Netanyahu and more right-wing Israelis have been pushing, is that, yeah, there can be some peaceful outcome, but that will come when the Palestinians recognize they lose and they face up to the fact that they're not going to get a 50-50 split or anything close to that. So the Trump plan, which was presented, kind of falls into that, which I'll explain in just a moment. So on Harris's end, both in the debate that happened just a few days ago and in her various speeches, she is always saying two-state solution, two-state solution, two-state solution. And later on, we'll look at her words for this stuff. But she has said, I support strongly the state of Israel and its security, roughly where it is today, potentially with some, annexation of some of the settlement blocks on the border in the West Bank with, land swaps. But generally, she's been two-state solution person with a state of Palestine alongside a state of Israel. In Trump's case, less so. Now, internationally, there's more support for a two-state solution than I've seen in a while. So what Harris is saying has a lot of support from countries in the region, because again, you have the UAE, you have the Saudis, you have other states saying, we need a two-state solution, and we need momentum towards a two-state solution to do things like help rebuild Gaza or fully normalize with Israel, etc. So internationally, in terms of regional partners, you have a lot of states that are saying, two-state solution is how you ultimately resolve the conflict. Now, that being said, let's go to some of the words from Trump. So he was asked by an Israeli outlet, I believe, do you think an outcome of that war, that referring to the conflict in Gaza, between Israel and Hamas should be a two-state solution between Israelis and Palestinians? He said, quote, most people thought it was going to be a two-state solution. I'm not sure a two-state solution anymore is going to work. There was a time when I thought two states could work. Now I think the two states is going to be very, very tough. I think it's going to be much tougher to get. And then again, we can also look at advisors. We're going to look at some of Harris's advisors later, but this guy in the bottom right, Keith Kellogg, did an interview on Fox in the aftermath of Ireland, Spain, and Norway recognizing a Palestinian state. So there's a number of countries that already recognize the state of Palestine, even though there's not really one in being at the moment, but you have a number of states who do that to help them diplomatically or otherwise. And Kellogg, who's one of Trump's main foreign policy people, said, quote, it makes no sense to have a Palestinian state, and that the recognition of such was the fault of President Biden for not encouraging our allies, quote, not to go there. So again, Kellogg is not Trump, but at least you have some of his advisors and also Trump himself kind of implying that there might not be a two-state solution. And again, when he's saying that, he's absolutely not saying, well, then the one state will be Palestine. What he's implying is that Israel will be there, but there will not be a Palestinian state. So it seems like that's the way Trump has been trending, especially since October 7th. In terms of how Americans feel about this, we have a majority of Americans who actually support a two-state solution. Because again, if you ask a small percentage of these might say they don't support the state of Israel, but the majority of them would say yes, a state of Israel and a state of Palestine. So you generally have support from both Americans on this stuff. And if you look, you actually even see a plurality of two-state, but even a significant portion of Americans who say one-state solution with single democratic state, full equal citizenship, etc. Now, to be honest, do I think that the majority of the people answering this among Americans have full understanding of what that means? I don't. But at the same time, it does show that at least the idea of a single democratic state does have appeal to Americans, for which those are often values that Americans care about, right? Democracy, etc. That's one of the reasons Americans have supported Israel. They're like, oh, Israel's a democracy. We often like to support democracies. So the idea of having a democracy in the region, one state or otherwise, I think for many Americans has some attractiveness to it. Now, the biggest challenge for a two-state solution is, well, Israelis and Palestinians themselves, in part because of the disillusionment of the past 30 years. If you look at Israelis being asked, would you agree to a deal which had an end to the current conflict in Gaza, a peace treaty with Arab states like Saudi Arabia, and a two-state solution? So a lot of positive things in there potentially for the Israelis. Only 29% of Israeli Jews said they would take that deal. Now, the Israeli left overwhelmingly says yes, but the center slightly under majority, and then the right kind of strongly opposed. And today in Israel, this is not 70 years ago where the left used to dominate. The right is much stronger in Israel today than the left. And so these percentages mean this outcome, which is a majority of Israeli Jews do not support it. Now, a majority of Arab Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel do, but again, they're only about 20% of the population, and they have even less power generally in the Israeli government. It's a similar story on the Palestinian side. You only have about a third of Palestinians who say, ultimately, I support a two-state solution. Now, I don't think that these percentages are fully accurate in the sense that I do think if you said to Israelis and Palestinians, you can have a secure state of Israel along a secure state of Palestine, there will be an end to the conflict, and each side will kind of recognize the other's sovereignty, I think you would get above 50% support. I think the reason you're getting this like 1/3 or so support is because people are not just answering this about what could happen, but whether they think it's even possible in the first place. So I think most Israelis look and they say, since the Second Intifada, and certainly since October 7th, there's no partner on the on the Palestinian side that we can trust. We don't believe that even if Abbas or other leaders want to make a deal, that they can make Hamas, be repressed or get in line. And so, we're not going to make a deal. We don't believe a two-state solution is the right outcome for Israelis. Palestinian side kind of say a reverse thing. Since the Second Intifada and, Israeli incursions into the West Bank and, lack of removal of checkpoints and Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, like, we don't think there's any partner on the Israeli side. And oh, by the way, Israel has its most right-wing government it's ever had in history, with the National Religious and Likud seemingly becoming stronger by the year. So we don't believe that there's going to ever be a true Palestinian state, particularly under this leadership, particularly with over 500,000 Israeli Jewish settlers in the West Bank. So in that broad sense, I think that these percentages are also just each side saying, we just don't think it's possible, or at least large percentages saying we don't think it's possible. Okay, so let's go into some of the final status issues, which again are borders. If you are going to have two states, or even if you're having one state, what are the borders? Jerusalem, both sides claim it to be their capital. Israelis and Palestinians both say it's their capital. There's holy places like this where you have the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism with the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, more broadly considered to be the third holiest site in Islam and, the holiest one in the region for Palestinians. You have the refugee issue, millions of Palestinian refugees settled in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, and Gaza. So what happens to them? Do they get to go back to their homes? Do they become citizens of new states? Is there compensation? And then a smaller issue, but still an issue, which is you have a large portion of Israeli Jews who are Mizrahi, who come from Arab states, and a number of them had their lands confiscated or their property confiscated amidst, to varying degrees in different countries, being pushed out or pressured out when they came to Israel. So that has to be reconciled as well. What happens with Israeli settlements? As I mentioned, there's over 500,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and hundreds of thousands more in East Jerusalem. If you combine those, it's getting close to 1 million. So are they withdrawn? Do they become part of Israel? If so, are there land swaps? So you got to figure this stuff out in terms of final status issues. So this is the map of the Trump plan. So if you remember it, he called it the, quote, deal of the century. This was what he was proposing. For the Israelis, I think for many Israelis, if this was really going to happen, I think you could probably get majority support for Israel, in part because, to my mind, this is quite a favorable plan for the Israelis. They keep the entire Jordan Valley. So you can see here, there's no Palestinian state that borders Jordan. So the Palestinians are entirely surrounded. And not only that, there's not contiguity in a real way between all these different portions of the West Bank. So Trump calls this a state. You can see a future state of Palestine, but this is not a strong, probably self-reliant state. It's one which the Israelis would still have significant control over. It wouldn't have significant access in terms of, having borders with other countries or otherwise. So it's one of the reasons that the Palestinians never really met with Trump throughout this. Now, that being said, the Israeli leadership didn't fully accept this either. They kind of did a yes, but didn't really think it was going to happen. I think because for Netanyahu, a lot of his right-wing allies / enemies, or rivals at least, don't want a Palestinian state, period, even if it's a very weak and non-contiguous one like that. So I think ultimately you get a majority of Israelis that would support this, although I think many Israelis, even on the left, would look at this and say, I don't think the Palestinians would accept this, or this would lead to kind of an end to the conflict, because this would still, not resolve a lot of things. But nonetheless, this was Trump's vision. He also, by the way, not as part of this vision, but previously recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel, in addition to recognizing Jerusalem as the Israeli capital. So these are some of the steps that he previously took, or at least tried to take, when he was in office. Now, Harris has not put out a plan or a vision, which again is not strange. I don't think I've ever seen a U.S. presidential candidate put out a map, because again, these maps are very sensitive things. They're the result of negotiations behind the scenes. So there's no reason that she would have a map. So what can we reason from? We can say, okay, if she's a two-state solution person that fits broadly within, the tradition from Biden and Obama and Clinton, I think it wouldn't probably be that far away from either what we call the Clinton parameters or the Geneva Initiative, which are one is a kind of track two thing, the Geneva Initiatives, but Clinton parameters refers to some of the final days in Clinton's time in office amidst, extensive, multi-year negotiations with Israelis and Palestinians. He put forth kind of a plan of sorts, and this is one of the maps that came out of it, which is basically saying, okay, you'd have a Palestinian state in the dark gray here, which is all of Gaza, and 96%, 95%, 97%, give or take, of the West Bank. You would see these dashed lines, these diagonal lines. Those are settlement blocks that would be annexed to Israel. And then there would be land swaps given in the form of a bridge between the West Bank and Gaza, and then maybe some more territory around the West Bank or around Gaza to make up for these settlement blocks that would be annexed by Israel. In terms of Jerusalem, it would be the capital of both states. Palestinian neighborhoods would become part of Palestine. Jewish Israeli neighborhoods would remain or become part of Israel. So that's the basic idea. I think, give or take some changes here or there, this is probably what Harris would propose or support. But again, we have a little less certainty on this because unlike Trump, she was not previously president and didn't present a plan. In terms of some other differences on settlements, I think Trump, being more in line with kind of the Israeli right, I think has been and would be less critical of the settlements, and would probably not take the step that the Biden and Harris administration has, which is they started to sanction violent Israeli settlers. So there have been settlers in the West Bank who have done, firebombing of Israeli towns and attacks, sometimes deadly ones, of Palestinian civilians there. So the Biden administration has started to sanction some of those individuals that have been, either convicted or with very strong evidence of them committing violent acts against Palestinian civilians. So I bet Harris would continue this policy. I don't think Trump would. So there's, one distinction there. It's not a massive one. A lot of pro-Palestinian supporters would say, yeah, this is, kind of smaller potatoes. But I've talked with others who are like, hey, this is something, to finally have the U.S. not just go after those who use violence in the West Bank who are Palestinians, but also Israelis who are using violence against civilians. To have the U.S., speak out against them and sanction them economically and otherwise is something. So there's one distinction. On Jerusalem, when Trump was president, he moved the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and he recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. I don't think Harris and Biden would have done that at that time. The U.S. position under all prior presidencies was to do that for sure, but to do it amidst a broader final deal with the Palestinians. So what Trump basically did is he kind of gave out a bunch of goodies to the Israelis before any deal, kind of in unilateral fashion, to say, okay, we're going to recognize the Golan. Okay, we're going to recognize Jerusalem as Israel capital. Okay, we're going to move the embassy without Israel kind of having to do anything regarding the Palestinians. You could argue about why that is, because Trump, wanted to improve his support base back home, which is, very pro-Israeli, because he can put his name on it and say, hey, this is a Trump thing. I moved the embassy here. Again, there's a lot of possibilities. But long and short, even though Harris and Biden, I don't think would have done it at that exact time, they're not going to reverse it. And they haven't reversed it. So they're going to recognize and have recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. They're not going to move the embassy back. They're not going to revoke U.S. recognition of that. So at this point, there's no difference, but there may have been one before. A place on which there is a difference, Palestinian refugees. So when the Palestinian refugee issue was created in 1948, you had about 750,000 Palestinians who became refugees. Now it's, 5 to 7 million because their descendants qualify as refugees under the UN. And so there's been back and forth on this between the Trump and Biden administrations. So when Trump was in office, and you can remember and look online at some speeches from Nikki Haley, his ambassador to the UN, saying that UNRWA, which is the UN organization that helps Palestinian refugees, is not a good thing, does not serve the Palestinians from their perspective. And so they cut all US funding for UNRWA. UNRWA provides humanitarian and food aid to the Palestinians. It provides education to Palestinian refugees. It's kind of the major go-between for funding for Palestinian refugees. So the US cut all the funding for that under Trump. Biden reinstated it. So that's a big difference. Now, it's a little less of a difference right now because you may have followed, as pictured here in the bottom, the Israelis published some evidence that there was about a dozen or so members of UNRWA who either took part in the October 7th attacks or were involved in some of the looting. The UN and UNRWA fired, I believe, most of those individuals, but nonetheless, it was a big black eye for the organization. Not just the US, but a number of European countries paused fundings for UNRWA as a result of that. Some of them have reinstituted it, but Biden actually signed a a law from Congress that the U.S. has paused funding for them until 2025. So as of now, the U.S. is not providing any significant funding to UNRWA. They are providing aid to the Palestinians in other ways, but not through UNRWA, as this stuff is being investigated and kind of worked through. So I think Harris would probably maintain that policy. I think she'd be more likely to return funding to UNRWA. I think Trump is unlikely to do so. So, there's another distinction there between the candidates. All right, what about October 7th, Gaza and the Israel-Hamas war? So let's start with Harris. So she said a number of things. She said, quote, Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization. Hamas has vowed to repeat October 7th until Israel is annihilated. No nation could possibly live with such danger, which is why we support Israel's legitimate military objectives to eliminate the threat of Hamas. So pretty clear regarding that organization. She also has said Israel has a right to defend itself, and we will remain steadfast in that conviction. Further, she said Israel has the right to defend itself against a terrorist organization, which is exactly what Hezbollah is. So both for Hamas and Hezbollah has said these are terrorist organizations. We fully support Israel, militarily going after them and defending themselves against these organizations, potentially even destroying these organizations. So those have been some of her comments on this stuff. In terms of post-conflict Gaza, she has said there's 5 principles. She said when she says we and our approach, she means, her and Biden's. No forcible displacement of Palestinians, no reoccupation. So no, Israeli military coming in and reoccupying the territory for a significant period of time. No siege or blockade, so preventing aid from going into Gaza. No reduction in territory, so Israel annexing part of Gaza. And no use of Gaza as a platform for terrorism. So speaking to, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, not wanting to have that either. So those are the principles that she said. Now, on kind of the Palestinian side of things, she also has said, hey, the Israeli government must do more to significantly increase the flow of aid, no excuses. She said, let me also be very clear, as I said before, we cannot conflate Hamas with the Palestinian people. So she said very clearly, Hamas is a terrorist organization from her perspective. Israel can defend itself against them and should, and they'll provide the weaponry and support for Israel to do so. But also, Hamas is not the same as all of the Palestinian people. There are many Palestinian civilians who don't support Hamas. And so, making a different distinction there, and I think in general, but also in terms of who's a legitimate military target. She says, quote, as Israel pursues its military objectives in Gaza, we believe Israel must do more to protect innocent civilians. So speaking to the fact that, yes, thousands, if not over 10,000 Hamas members have been killed by Israel, but also you've had, a larger number than that of civilians who have been killed. Further, we have been clear the Palestinians have a right to dignity and self-determination, and Israelis and Palestinians must enjoy equal measures of prosperity and freedom. So again, implying the fact that strongly support Israel, strongly support Israel's security and prosperity, but the Palestinians should also have citizenship in their own state. They should have dignity and prosperity as well, both because I think she believes that's the just outcome, but also because I think she believes that's how you ultimately resolve this conflict. If the Palestinians live eternally without citizenship, without rights, without employment in a significant way, that just is grievances building on grievances, and the conflict's not going to resolve itself. She's also finally said regarding some of the death in Gaza, quote, the images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time. We cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent. So Harris kind of following in many ways some of the Biden administration's line, maybe a little more forthright on some of this stuff, but basically saying strongly support Israel, will always be there to back Israel, support billions of dollars of military and economic aid to Israel, support Israel in its fight against terrorist organizations, Hamas and Hezbollah, but also do not support the killing of innocent Palestinian civilians, support the long-term goal of having a Palestinian state and Palestinians living in dignity and prosperity, and will not be silent about, when Palestinian civilians are killed, just as she won't be silent about and condemn when Israeli civilians are killed on October 7th or otherwise, and has spoken often about the hostages as well and getting them out. In terms of her advisors, so her national security advisor currently as vice president is this guy, Philip Gordon, would probably be her national security advisor as she became president. He said, quote, there is no enduring defeat of Hamas without a credible governance and security alternative in Gaza. So saying that, yes, you should go and try to destroy and weaken Hamas, but you need to have some alternative. And it can't and shouldn't just be, the Israeli military staying there and governing governing Gaza forever. So he has generally supported, having the Palestinian Authority that, can be reformed, return into Gaza or another type of governance structure, but, kind of suggesting what the Harris policy might be here. And then he says, again, as someone who supports Israel's security, the best way to ensure Israel's long-term security is a two-state solution, and that they've been engaging with the newly appointed Palestinian Authority government to advance reforms there. So this is in many ways the debate between Trump and Harris, in some ways debate between the Israeli center and left and right in Israel, which is all of those actors want Israel to be safe and secure and exist as a strong state. They differ on how to get there. For the Israeli right, you feel like you get there by, keep destroying Hamas, weaken the Palestinians, make them recognize that they've lost, keep them in a non-state situation where they don't have full autonomy or citizenship, and the Israelis can kind of control them and control their lives. That's the only way you're going to have a secure Israel. That's kind of the more Israeli right-wing position. For the Israeli, to some extent, center or center left, it's more, okay, we can have a secure Israel, but one of the ways that we get there in the long term is having a secure, Palestinian state. So you don't have these grievances. So you have a government that can, crack down on non-state actors that would use violence against the Israelis, and that the American position on the left and Democrats kind of support that. Whereas Republicans, you've had some two-state Republicans, but more and more, I think they're on the line with the Israeli right, which is, one state solution, just Israel, maybe a greater Israel. What has Trump said? Again, not full distinctions from Harris on this stuff. He said, I would say I would act very much the same as you did. This is to the Israelis. So saying in the aftermath of October 7th, you would have been crazy not to. Only a fool would not do that. That was a horrible attack. So first saying like, hey, I support Israel's strong military response to October 7th, given what happened. But then he also says, quote, let's get back to peace and stop killing people. Get it over with. They've got to finish what they finish. They have to get it done, get it over with, and get it over with fast, because we have to. You have to get back to normalcy and peace. You have to have a victory, and it's taking a long time. So basically saying that, look, he doesn't support, Israel, or does not want Israel to kind of keep this going for a long period of time. So he wants it to be wrapped up. And then he also says, in terms of critiques, he kind of thinks Israel's losing the PR war of sorts. He said, I think Israel made a very big mistake. I wanted to call Israel and say, don't do it. Those photos and shots, I mean, moving shots of bombs being dropped into buildings in Gaza. And I said, oh, that's a terrible portrait. It's a very bad picture for the world. So basically saying that, not saying, hey, I have solidarity with, or necessarily, denouncing the killing of Palestinian civilians, but saying that, hey, the vision of this stuff where Israel's dropping, previously, especially 2,000-pound bombs in urban neighborhoods, that's a vision that, he thinks is not a good one for Israel's image internationally. And certainly we've seen, some of the outcry in the Middle East and Europe and, even in the US on some of that stuff. So he's also kind of pointed to that in terms of critiques of the Israeli conduct in the conflict. Now, in terms of the push going forward, there's been a broader push by Biden to get the Israeli hostages out amidst a ceasefire deal in which Israel would pull back from some, if not all, of Gaza. The deal hasn't happened, I think, both because Hamas has some incentives to not make the deal, and I think Netanyahu has some incentives to not make the deal to varying degrees. They both kind of do better in a conflict context, especially now. For Hamas, it helps to maybe mobilize more of the broader, Arab world and others on their side or against the Israelis. From Netanyahu's perspective, the second the war ends, there's probably going to be a commission about October 7th and what happened there, and he may well face renewed push on the charges against him for corruption and some of his legal issues. So he has some incentive to kind of not end the war anytime soon, because elections could come in which he might lose. So long and short, there has not been a deal. Let's talk a little bit about the debate in terms of what each candidate said. So you can read through this stuff in terms of Harris, but I just want to go through a couple things that she said. She first said, again, let's talk how we got here. October 7th, Hamas, this terrorist organization, slaughtered 1,200 Israelis, most of them young people attending a concert. Women were horribly raped. And so I absolutely say Israel has a right to defend itself. But then also says how Israel defends itself matters. Far too many Israeli innocent Palestinians have been killed, children and mothers. So the war must end. So we need a ceasefire deal that gets the hostages out. And so that's why she and Biden have been working round the clock to try to do this. And then in the long term, she said, we need to chart a course for a two-state solution. U.S. will always support the Israelis defending itself, particularly as it relates to Iran and its proxies. But two-state solution where not just the Israelis, but also Palestinians have security, self-determination, and dignity. That's what she's looking for. In terms of what Trump said, he started talking a little bit about Russia stuff and Ukraine, but then he gets into it and he says, When she mentions about Israel, she hates Israel. Oops, sorry. She hates Israel. If she's president, I believe Israel would not exist within 2 years from now. I've been pretty good at predictions, saying again, she hates Israel. He also then says she hates the Arab population because the whole place is going to get blown up. Arabs, Jewish people, Israel will be gone. He implies that October 7th would have happened if he was in office because he says that the reason it happened is because Iran had money to fund Hamas to carry out the attack. And they wouldn't have thought of doing it if he was in office. So kind of makes a number of claims regarding it. Doesn't necessarily say resolution to it, but says it wouldn't have happened if he was there. And if they elect Harris, that Israel's not going to exist in a couple of years. Harris responds because he made this direct charge to her. So the moderator said, hey, he says you hate Israel. She kind of reiterates, I do not hate Israel, and he knows that. She's saying that he admires dictators and wants to be one, talks about non-Israeli stuff. So ultimately, a lot of kind of back and forth here, but a couple key things right on the Harris side, reinforcing those points we saw from before about Hamas is a terrorist organization, October 7th, a terrible attack, killed Israelis and slaughtered Israelis. Israel should have full support against Hamas, against Iran proxies, etc., but also too much loss of life of Palestinian civilians. Conflict needs to end, needs to have a ceasefire that gets the Israeli hostages out, but also builds a path towards a Palestinian state with dignity and self-determination. For Trump, not necessarily laying out a plan, although we've talked about some of that before, but just basically criticizing Harris and saying if she's in office, it's going to go bad for the Israelis. So, trying to push at some of that stuff, which gets at some of the internal discussion among Americans and more broadly within the Democratic Party, where you've seen some disagreement where generally the Biden administration, I think, has been quite supportive of Israel in this conflict. So, trying to maintain a lot of its pro-Israeli voters. But then in terms of its more pro-Palestinian voters, of which there are a number within the Democratic Party, many of them have been quite critical of the Biden and Harris administration's conduct during this. So she's kind of, had these nuanced positions. I think she believes them, but also because she's dealing with the fact that internally there have been some strife among Democratic voters over these issues. Now, there have been some polls that have come out in the past week or so. They're not perfect because it's tough to poll exactly just Jewish individuals or just Muslim individuals in terms of identifying, etc. And this poll on the left came from a Jewish Democratic pollster. So when you see a pollster that's, affiliated with the Democrats, affiliated with the Republicans, you want to take it at least with a little bit of grain of salt because they have ways of potentially surveying people that are going to give an outcome that they like. But at least in terms of this poll that was by the Jewish Democratic Council, they found 68% of Jewish voters supporting Harris, 25% for Trump. So that wouldn't be too far off historically. Usually you get around that percentage, sometimes even higher, supporting the Democrats among American Jews. But there has been some talk, particularly among Republicans and those on the right, saying, oh, because of Biden and Harris and because of what Trump's done for Israel before, that they can, bite off a significant chunk of the American Jewish vote, maybe even get half of it or more. So, we'll see. In terms of Muslim Americans, there were polls done much more diverse in terms of voting. You had in some states Jill Stein getting the largest portion of the American Muslim vote. In others, it was Harris. It was never Trump, but Trump was actually maybe getting more than he did in 2020 election. So more of a mixed bag with American Muslims here. And again, that's not the only issue that American Muslims care about. They care about many other things, domestically or otherwise, just like any other American. But, some of them certainly care about Gaza, and, it's a challenge that the Harris has been facing. Final thing before I just say a couple resources and wrap on protests. So for Trump, he spoke with donors and said, quote, one thing I would do is any student that protests, I throw them out of the country. There are a lot of foreign students. As soon as they hear that, they're going to behave. So basically threatening the fact that you have foreign students at MIT or elsewhere. And he's saying if they would protest, he would potentially push to have them expelled or otherwise revoke their visas. And then said, quote, if he's elected, he would ban refugees from, quote, terror-infested areas, including Gaza, arrest pro-Hamas thugs who vandalize government property, and cancel funding and accreditation for universities that spread anti-Semitic propaganda. So, very strident policies there from Trump. If you remember, he had the quote-unquote Muslim ban during his prior time in office where he banned travel and immigration from a number of countries in the Middle East. So kind of implying that he would do a version of that again. And then again, go very strongly after protesters, both on American campuses or otherwise, who are protesting, kind of more broadly for the Palestinian cause. In terms of Harris, again, kind of this more nuanced position where when there were the protests in DC that took down the American flag, some of these pro-Palestinian protesters, she denounced that and said those are, quote, despicable acts by unpatriotic protesters and dangerous hate-fueled rhetoric. So, being very strongly against that. But then also saying, I support the right to peacefully protest, but then at the same time saying anti-Semitism, hate, and violence of any kind have no place. So if folks want to peacefully protest, even if they want to peacefully protest, her administration's policies, I think she says that that's a right people should have as Americans, but that if the speech or the protest, bridges into anti-Semitism or targeting just the Jewish people for their identity, that's not something that she supports. And then more broadly with the protesters, she said, there are things some of the protesters are saying that I absolutely reject again. So I don't mean to endorse their points, but she also says we have to navigate it. And she understands some of the emotion behind it. The fact that obviously people seeing both the October 7th attacks and the Israeli invasion of Gaza with the loss of life on both sides, that's, 1,200 Israelis dying on October 7th. Again, by many accounts, 40,000 Palestinians dying since the Israeli invasion. There's a lot of emotions, I think, in each community and the communities that support them. And so she's saying that she understands that even if she doesn't agree with all the positions that are expressed at the protest. So if you want to read more about this stuff, I think there's a lot of things you can go to. So in terms of a single book that brings in both the history and Israeli and Palestinian narratives, again, I point you to this book, Arabs and Israelis, that's co-authored by Abdulmunim Said Ali, an Egyptian scholar, Shai Feldman, an Israeli scholar, and Khalil Shakaki, a Palestinian scholar. So a great job there. If you want to read more about the history of U.S. policy on these issues, Aaron David Miller was in the room for a lot of this stuff and wrote a great book on it. Donald Kurd, a great scholar who wrote about this from the impact of to the Palestinians in terms of U.S. involvement. And then William Quandt, also an academic, but someone who was in the Carter administration, some others regarding the ongoing peace process during that era. So you could check all of that stuff out. Again, in terms of resources, I implore you, it's not that American media outlets are, terrible. There's a lot of good ones who do good quality reporting, but the way that they're going to frame things, the stories they're going to cover, but even more so not cover, is just not going to be the same as Palestinian outlets, Israeli outlets, broader Middle Eastern outlets. So, you should look at this stuff. You don't have to speak Hebrew. You don't have to speak Arabic. These are all English language resources that I have on the screen here. So if you want to read, like, what are Israelis thinking? What are the op-eds? What are the stories being reported? You can see that. If you want to know, what are Palestinians thinking? Again, actually, at the top of both of these, I don't have news outlets. I have actually polling firms. So this is a Palestinian polling outlet. This is an Israeli polling outlet. So often no better way to know what are Palestinians and Israelis thinking than read polls from them, which again, you're not generally going to get in American media. So see this, follow the stories, follow the narratives. Doesn't mean you have to agree with what's written in the Israeli newspapers or Palestinian newspapers, but I think understanding what people's lives are like in these communities and what their perspectives are is helpful, whatever kind of your politics and views are. Final thing I want to say is the Men at MIT folks let me know that there's going to be an upcoming STAR Forum in a couple of weeks, pictured here with Dennis Ross and Melanie Kemetz. So if you don't know who Dennis Ross is, he was in the room for a lot of these negotiations under the Clinton administration in particular regarding Israeli and Palestinian negotiations. So he's going to talk about the current situation, but I'm sure he'll talk a bit about and answer questions about, prior negotiations and what the prospects are for peace and resolution now. And then Melanie Kemetz is an excellent professor from up the road at Harvard on broadly Middle East politics. So I believe she's going to kind of be a moderator and ask questions and add some of her own insights as well. So if you're interested, that's a talk. It's live. It's not just on Zoom on Tuesday, September 24th. So check it out and register if you're interested in attending. But thank you overall. Hopefully this was an interesting talk. I know it's a little like the MIT education, drinking from a fire hose. There was a lot in there, but this is a recording, so you can slow it down or go back and check whatever you'd like. If you'd like to connect with me, you can always do so on LinkedIn. That's where I post a lot of my upcoming talks, publications, events. If you have questions, that's my email. And if you want to follow some of my other stuff, you can see my website there at the bottom. So once again, I'm Peter Krause. It's been an honor to talk with all of you. It's been an honor to do the live sessions where we have Q&A and back and forth. So I hope to see you at some of those coming up. But in any case, stay safe. And hopefully today you've got a lot more good information about the U.S. election, the positions of Vice President Harris and former President Trump, so you can hopefully make a more informed decision one way or the other. So thank you very much. Have a great day.